We were the only Chinese family in that area attending the school for a long time.
I do remember there was an instance when I was about probably 6 or 7 years old. This was before I was even allowed to walk home from school, but when I was waiting on the playground, there was a group of teenagers that came over
and I do remember being chased. But what I don't remember, and I think it was just the Lord just erasing that from my brain, is that they would try to tear my clothes off.
It was really obvious because I was the only Asian kid within that entire area. So like being ganged up on is pretty traumatizing because they did verbally, and not only verbally, but they also physically assaulted me. It was something that kind of stuck with me for like the years, especially now where the threat of physical violence is always imminent.
Matthew Lee and Helen Lee were born a generation apart, but they share eerily similar stories. The anti-Chinese and the anti-Asian sentiment are still felt in the Canadian society. For many Chinese Canadians, the rise of anti-Asian hate is not the first time, but rather a beat from the past. Our story begins with a train ride that will take us back as far as the 1880s. Welcome to Beyond the Cycles. In June 2006, about 100 Chinese Canadians boarded a train called the Redress Express in Vancouver. The destination was Ottawa. Helen Lee and her family were on the train.
My name is Helen Lee. I am the granddaughter of Funhei Lam, who was an activist on the Chinese head tax campaign.
The train traveled the nation on the very own Canadian Pacific Railway, a remnant of the very first Chinese immigration to Canada. While the first recorded wave began in the gold rush of 1858 in Fraser River, British Columbia, 1881 to 1885 saw more than 15,000 Chinese workers coming to the construction of the CPR.
It all started when the Chinese laborers were needed to build the railroad, right? The Canadian Pacific Railroad. At first they didn't want the Chinese laborers. They were thinking, the Chinese are taking away all the jobs from the white people, right? Until it was quite evident that no one wanted to do that hard, dangerous job. To complete the railroad on time, they needed the Chinese workers. So, okay, you're welcome to come to work on the railroad.
To build a railway over the mountainous terrain of British Columbia, over 10,000 men were required to do the task at the time. The people who were in charge realized that white workers are expensive and lacking in performance, so they found a solution: an efficient, reliable, and cheaper alternative: Chinese workers.
It was dangerous work that the Chinese did, blasting through the Rockies. They say every mile of track cost 4 Chinese lives. And on top of all of that, they didn't even pay them well. They were paid a fraction of what a normal worker would have gotten.
They saved themselves $4 million by using Chinese workers. It started with 2,326 Chinese arrived in Canada from 1876 to 1880. But that number kept rising. 3,000 in 1881, then over 8,000 in 1882. Among all of the Chinese men, Dora's Nip grandfather was one of them.
My name is Dora Nip, and I am a lawyer by training. I've been involved in Chinese Canadian history for quite a long time. That's actually one of my passions. My grandfather arrived in Canada in 1881 to build the railroad. He was 17 years old. 10 years after that, in 1891, he sent for my grandmother, and the family settled in Victoria. So that's where my dad and all his brothers and sisters were born. My grandfather came, he was recruited to work on the CPR, and about 17,000 young Chinese workers were recruited at that time to build the western portion of the CPR from Port Moody to just past the Rocky Mountains.
John A. MacDonald's promised a 10-year progress in the National Railway. With the help of the Chinese workers, the project only took 4 years to finish. The last spike was driven to the ground on November 7, 1885. But not all of them made it out alive. It is estimated that over 4,000 Chinese workers lost their lives due to explosive, hypothermia, malnutrition, and violent encounters with white workers. In the heart of downtown Toronto rise two Chinese railway workers looking into the railroads. The Chinese Railway Workers Memorial was erected to commemorate the contribution and sacrifice of the nameless heroes that helped unite the nation. But their story wasn't finished. With no means of going back to China when the labor was no longer needed, thousands drifted in near destitution along the completed track.
After the railroad was completed, apparently my grandfather, he stayed, and he didn't seem to have any intention of returning to China. He was the youngest of 5 boys. So if you can imagine, he arrived at the age of 17. And then I was told that he worked on Vancouver Island, stringing up telephone lines. So the Chinese helped to establish the telephone lines on Vancouver Island. Then from there, he managed to save up enough money, sent for a wife, and he set up a business in Cumberland.
Some had enough money to go home. Others wandered across the country, struggling to find a job.
My name is Winnie Ng, and I'm a time community and labor activist since the 1970s. In the sawmills industry, 80% of the workers were Chinese workers. Because the work was too harsh and too hard, both working and living conditions were quite deplorable. So other workers won't take it. Plus, the employers can also pay the Chinese workers, legitimately half of what they pay the white workers. A Chinese worker would get paid $1 per day, whereas white workers would get $3.50 a day. It's a dramatic ritual of exploitation here.
The Chinese did do their best, and they contributed substantively to the unification of Canada, yet they were still treated as aliens. They're third-class citizens, actually subhuman, really, because, at one point, I think they were comparing the Chinese worker to an instrument, right? A mechanical instrument to get a job. They had no rights, no dignity, very oppressed, segregated existence they lived, right?
After the CPR, the Chinese are no longer needed, and politicians in the West started pressuring the federal government into creating anti-Chinese policies. What was the reason? In their eyes, they were not real Canadians, and there were too many of them. So in 1885, the Canadian government gave in and imposed a head tax on all immigrants from China.
What happened with my grandfather, my grandmother, is that when my grandfather arrived in 1881, there was no head tax at that time. They needed the Chinese labor to build that western portion of the CPR. By 1891, when my grandmother arrived, the head tax was already $50. So in 1885, immediately after the Chinese completed the CPR, the western portion in 1884, the Canadian government imposed the first of a series of what we call head taxes under a Chinese Immigration Act. So there's a Chinese Immigration Act of 1885, and the head tax was $50. In 1900, it became $100. And in 1903, the head tax was $500. And $500 at that time could buy 2 houses. So my paternal grandmother, she had to pay the $50 head tax. So, in this way, in terms of Chinese Canadian history, we joke around saying that we're Chinese Canadian royalty because we have one member of the family who worked on the CPR and another one who paid the head tax. Take a look at the history of the Chinese community. There was all kinds of opposition to their arrival. When they wanted cheap labor, they were welcome. As soon as their cheap labor was no longer wanted or needed, nobody wanted them around. And my grandfather just was like many families at that time. This is where they wanted to be. They wanted to settle here, they wanted to build a life here, and they wanted to build a life here for their children, knowing that the opportunities in Canada were probably better than in China, because there's war going on, there was starvation.
Both my grandfathers were very young when they entered Canada, and they paid the required $500 head tax. My father's father was 9 years old, 8 years old. And my mother's father was 17 years old. So these young boys, they would make their way from their ancestral villages to Hong Kong. Then they would board a steamship to Vancouver. Then they would pay the head tax, be detained for a number of days or weeks until they were allowed out. And then they would travel by rail across Canada alone. So, however, the Chinese, it didn't deter the Chinese. Well, actually, it did because there was less of them coming. It took longer for them to come because they had to pool their money, right, and save it up. But they still came nonetheless.
It didn't really stop them. From 1904 to 1924, Canada saw over 40,000 Chinese entering the country. When the federal government shelved the policy, they already collected around $23 million from the Chinese. But they didn't shelve the head taxes for nothing.
And then the government imposed a harsher measure, the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923. I find it very funny. It's called the Chinese Immigration Act, but basically, in essence, it's better known as the Exclusion Act because the Chinese were excluded legislatively. The doors closed, and no more Chinese immigrants were allowed in, with a few exceptions. Well, my parents, they were born in Xinhui and Tucson in Canton, China. My dad had come to Canada earlier after his university studies to join his father working in the restaurant business. After working many years, he decided, I want to get married. So he decided to go back to Hong Kong in hopes of finding a bride. And he met my mother, and they got married quickly, and then she was brought back to Canada. It was only then that my mother actually met her father. Can you imagine meeting your father at the age of 23? She had no opportunity to get to know her father previously because of the racist legislation.
Helen's family was among many Chinese families affected by the Exclusion Act in 1923. Her grandmother was not able to see her husband again until the Canadian government repealed the act in 1947.
Now, my grandmother, Fun Hei Lam, she arrived in Toronto in 1958. And she finally reunites with her husband. They're both in their 50s. She meets him at the airport, and he's got in his hands, can you imagine this, new winter boots and a coat. Like, how does he even figure out her size? They haven't met in decades. And how would you even greet each other at the airport? How awkward is that? You're like 50 years old. Oh my God. So my grandmother was essentially a single parent because of that. And she took care of her family through Civil War, through the Japanese occupation, through World War II, through the Communist Revolution. She had to protect her family. She had to feed her family. She had to protect her land, protect her property during all of that social upheaval. And then at 50, she finally makes it out to Canada. They're together. They had 12 lovely years together. Nobody was complaining. They were happy to finally be united together under one household. They had their home. They lived there 12 years, and then my grandfather dies. So in the end, they were married for 45 years, but they only lived together for less than 16 of those years.
Fewer than 50 Chinese came to Canada during the Exclusion Act. For 24 years, many Chinese men couldn't see their wives and children. Some didn't even make it to see the day of reunion. Families torn apart. The damage has been done.
Tragically, for our family, we eventually reunited, right? But many families were not able to reunite. They starved because of the Exclusion Act, because what happened was they couldn't reunite, and then the World War came, right? And during the war, I remember my grandmother telling me that, all mail stopped. And so all her remittances stopped. And so if any families just relied on their remittance from the dad from Canada, they weren't coming. So my grandfather, actually, before he died, he was such a proud Canadian. He was so happy to be in Canada. He always wanted Canada to be his home and the home of his family. He was not a traveler that was just coming here for a short time and then leaving again. He wanted to establish his family here because he thought that this was a beautiful place to have a family. So he wished that my grandmother would live to see the day because he believed that the Canadian government eventually should do right.
Despite all of the head taxes and the discrimination, the Chinese Canadians did not stand down. They showed their resilience and they took it to the street.
So there were a couple of kids who were always picking on the Chinese kids. So my father and his brothers were very athletic, and my father was a boxer. So one day he said, that was enough. And there was this one fellow, they called him Porky Anderson. And he was picking on the Chinese kids all the time. So my dad said, you know what? Okay, come on, let's have a fight. And he boxed him, and Porky Anderson basically stopped picking on Chinese kids. The Chinese community did not sit by quietly or idly, in the face of discrimination. Chinese community has always come out. What people don't know is that they came out and they protested, okay? They rallied. Let me tell you, the Chinese had the first strike in Vancouver. They protested all kinds of anti-Chinese legislation. They took to the streets.
The Chinese workers organized under the Chinese Labor Associations, which was formed in 1916. The workers came out on strike. The reason was because the employers were using piecework system to reduce 10% of the Chinese workers' wages. You could only be pushed so much, right? And I think, to me, the lessons is when you get exploited, when you get pushed down, there are only two responses in life. Either you lie down and let people walk over you, or you stand up and fight back.
In 1983, two Chinese men, Doug Mark and Shaq Yi, asked the local member of parliament for a refund of their $500 head taxes. While their request was denied, they kickstarted a redress campaign that would last for decades. Everyone's goal was clear. They want an apology and they want compensation.
With the adoption of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau in 1982, Mr. Mack thought, he's a union activist, so he's thinking, well, it's about time that Canada addressed its racist past because, the head tax and the Exclusion Act against the Chinese was blatantly racist. In 1984, the Canadian Chinese National Council decided that they would register all the head taxpayer certificates or the certificates of surviving spouses that they had in their possession or descendants had in their families, and grandmother was one of them. So she went and got her head tax certificate registered. And you might think, why would somebody even have this old document from so long ago, right? But you have to remember that they paid dearly for that document.
So CCNC in Toronto, the Chinese Canadian National Council based in Toronto, there were activists in Vancouver that would start registering head taxpayers. And then in Toronto, we start promoting and registering head taxpayer. That's how we started the whole campaign. People came with their elderly parent and holding on to their head tax paper, or there were also widows and family members of the head taxpayer who had passed away. So across Canada, there were over 4,000 head taxpayers that got registered.
Yeah, well, we all worked on the head tax redress campaign at the various stages, joining. Of course, grandmother joined first, right? So in 1984, my grandmother registered my grandfather's head tax certificate with CCNC. My grandmother just jumped into that campaign and she threw her all in it. The CCNC redress campaign, it focused on a parliamentary apology and symbolic compensation for head taxpayers or their surviving spouses if the head taxpayer was dead. My grandmother thought it was an issue. She thought it was legislative racism. It was an issue of fairness. And she was not ashamed to put her face on it, to put her name on it. Yes, I'm Phun Hey Lam, and this is my story. I'm in my 60s, and I want justice. I want my money. I want my story to be heard. I want a parliamentary apology. And so that was my grandmother. She attended awareness sessions, community meetings. She got people to sign petitions, attended rallies. It was a huge community mobilization effort, and it spanned 2 decades. The government dragged its heels. It tried to win by attrition, surely, and at one point in time, I was like so mad. I was like, we should go to Ottawa and we should put sticks in the ground on the lawn, noting every death of every head taxpayer, every spouse of a head taxpayer, just to prove that they are trying to kill us off so they don't have to do anything, recognize the injustice.
We were lobbying the Liberal government for a long time, and it didn't come through. And Stephen Harper from the Conservatives ended up seizing the moment and recognize this as an issue that he can gain some vote. And so when he got elected in 2006 as a minority government, one of his earlier acts was to deliver the apology to the community. From 1984 to 2006, it took 22 years before the apology would come down and before a symbolic compensation were given to all the head taxpayers. It was a moment to celebrate, a moment of elations, but it's also a moment of deep sadness that had this apology had come earlier, 10 years earlier, there would be a whole lot more survivors, more head taxpayers who could enjoy that moment of restitutions, And so in that sense, it was a bittersweet moment.
Therefore, Mr. Speaker, once again, on behalf of the people and government of Canada, we offer a full apology to Chinese Canadians for the head tax and express our deepest sorrow for the subsequent exclusion of Chinese immigrants. Gana Dai Dohi.
Many families, many head taxpayers were able to board the Redress train that came from Vancouver across to Ottawa, picking up head taxpayers and their families as they went. And also CCNC, we had the last spike that Pierre Burton had given us, and he had inspired us to say, we hope that the Chinese community would see redress. So we presented that back to the Prime Minister during the reconciliation meeting. My son, he was 6 at the time. We pulled him out of school. And so 4 generations sat in the House of Commons to hear the parliamentary apology. And that was 2006 in June. And then I was thinking, as I was looking, I was sitting in the gallery and we had really front row seats kind of thing. And it was really good. And I was looking at all the seniors and thinking, and looking at my mother and my grandmother, and I thought, I have 4 generations here. We fought over 2 decades, but we're here to hear the apology. We didn't know actually what the announcement was, but we were just so excited that we were invited, right? Grandpa, you would be so proud of your women. You would be so proud of your women. Grandmother was 98 at the time, and she was able to see her day.
And so the train arrived in Ottawa. The redress campaign was a success, but indeed, it was a bittersweet moment. There were only 30 head tax survivors in 2006, and descendants of the payers did not get the compensation. However, it shows the resilience of Chinese Canadians. They have stood up and fought for their justice. Unfortunately, it was not long until the anti-Asian sentiment in Canada is back again. As the world entered the COVID-19 global pandemic, people started to point fingers.
I'm Matthew Lee. I'm 22 years old right now. I'm a student at the University of Alberta, majoring in kinesiology. I was originally born in Edmonton, but I grew up in rural Alberta. So that kind of would tell you exactly kind of the environment I grew up in. So definitely going from a city to a small rural town, definitely a big change in environment. I just finished my clinical practicum. This was back in April, but there was a guy who came in, refused to wear a mask. I had nothing to do with the conversation. I was sitting behind the front desk. He walks around the counter, gets in my face and says, this is all your fault. Like, there's a reason why, this is a reason why the economy's crashed. One of the physiotherapists had to step in and push him aside because there was definitely signs that it was going to get physical. So it was something that made me realize that this is kind of like a new reality that we're living in, and people haven't been talking about it until recently.
I would go out every day for a walk. We're turned into one of the quiet paths, and there was this woman with her ski poles and mask, and upon seeing me start saying, "Oh, not again." It was just, I walked away. I didn't even have the energy to confront her, to say any more. It's just, what's the point here,
Matthew and Winnie was one of the many Chinese Canadians and Asian Canadians who encountered racial discrimination during this time. Meanwhile, Helen was lobbying to protect her grandmother as the pandemic swept through her long-term care home.
I thought, Grandma, we did it. Help's got to be coming now from the government, surely. But little did I know that, grandmother died just as the CTV, the national, aired her story. In her last days, she was 111 when she died. With her nursing home down to 20% staff, half of the residents sick with COVID, and very little PPE left, I thought, oh my goodness, we're going to need help. Frailty of them being a senior and they're not sure, what they may meet on the street or around the corner by themselves without anybody and with just using a cane. We've seen a lot of seniors been beaten up, right? So that has, I think, impacted us.
You would think that in today, when people are more aware, better informed, should be better educated. Chinese community has been here such a long time, as well as other people who look Chinese, that you would think that by now, that kind of attitude against Asians would have dissipated, but it clearly hasn't. And that's what COVID has highlighted. It's really shone the light on how not only ugly racism is, but how persistent it is.
In April 2021, the CCNC reported 1,150 anti-Asian racial incidents in Canada, with Ontario and British Columbia taking over 84% of them. Then, everyone's worst fear happened in the south of our borders.
This morning, the FBI is now investigating a shooting spree that left 8 people dead at multiple massage parlors in the Atlanta area.
6 of the 8 people killed in the shootings were Asian women. The tragedy in Atlanta has brought anti-Asian racism to the forefront, but incidents of anti-Asian hate crimes in Canada and the United States have been on the rise, particularly since the beginning of the pandemic.
It was the final straw, as Asian Americans took it to the streets and social media to rally. Asian Canadians did the same. From Toronto to Vancouver to Calgary, the resilience is shown across Canada.
My name is Kristen Wong Tam, and I'm a Toronto City Councillor. I represent a very downtown part of the city. I'm a first-generation Chinese-Canadian immigrant. I'll tell you, when I looked out from the stage and saw this massive crowd engulf Nathan Phillips Square, it was such a powerful visual. Not only was it a sea of black-haired individuals like myself, but people were coming out in a pandemic. They were masked and they were physically distanced, and they seemed to keep to themselves or their household. And that was a very powerful image, because Nathan Phillips Square hasn't had a single event programmed on the square since the beginning of the pandemic. So as a city councillor, for me to turn out and see that big, powerful visual gathering of individuals was pretty moving. The other thing I would recognize here is that it just wasn't the bodies that were there, because that's just the visual, but it was actually the energy that was there. And I could sense, it's sometimes people say, how do you feel it? I felt it. I felt that the community was relieved to be with one another. They gravitated to each other safely. They wanted to know that they weren't alone. And they also wanted to send out a message to the world that was watching, to the city that was watching, is that we are strong and united.
I was happy to see that they were mobilized so quickly because the word got out really fast. And in Toronto, despite the weather, it looked like it was going to rain. And, we had a really good turnout.
And what they're doing is they have to do that. You have to take to the streets. You have to protest. You have to raise your voice in the same way that earlier generations did. So in terms of what is happening now, very proud that so many have come up. And I think that's really important to know that our current histories, there are lots of gaps that still need to be filled. And you fill those gaps by talking to people. Now, so many of the older generation have gone now. So then you would rely on the stories that their children remember of their parents and grandparents and the stories that were passed on to them.
Every generation have to do our own fight, and we have to record our own history. So, I really appreciate the African proverbs that, we walk on the shoulders of those who come before us. That sense of collective agency, it's I'm going to do whatever it takes. I might not see the results in my lifetime, but I'm going to do whatever it takes to ensure the door is open and open much wider for the generations to come.
Councillor Wong Tam understands the importance of her role in combating anti-Asian discrimination, and she continued to work with the City of Toronto on upcoming strategies.
I want to make sure that my son, who's just 2 years old, is going to have access to information and accurate historical data when he goes to school. I want him to see in his school books stories of his culture and his family and his community. I want that for every child of every racial background. I want all of these stories to be learned.
Grandmother did her very best in highlighting a lot of discrimination, whether it was race or whether it was age. So now I lobby for seniors' rights and national standards on long-term care because I know that, my grandmother would have been out there doing that. I remember in my early lobbying days, in the early 1990s. But this year, I believe personally, it's more important than ever. It's more important than ever for us to gather, to recognize it, to call it out, to take our space, to use our voices, to use all the talents and everything that we have at our disposal to be educating, to be building awareness. It's just like head tax all over again,
But now finally, I'm starting to see people from my parents' generation, people from my generation being more openly vigilant about these types of things. It's definitely a step in the right direction. I don't think we should stay silent any longer. This is something that clearly affects us. Black Lives Matter was definitely another monumental thing that started to happen last year. But right now, especially during the pandemic, we're finally giving ourselves a platform to actually voice our opinions, voice our perspectives out, and actually be able to stand up for ourselves as a community.
The Redress Express might have arrived and stopped its journey in Ottawa in 2006. But the trend of resilience, representing different generations of Asian Canadians across the transcontinental railway of solidarity, is still going. We never truly know when it will reach its final destination, but we will keep going beyond the cycles.
Well, the new generation, the children of those who built this nation, who built this nation. Now the time is...
This episode was produced by Minh Truong, with additional production from Heidi Lee. Music is by Adrian Bueno, along with the Head Tax Blues, which you are listening to right now, by Sean Gunn.
Blue.